Hi, everyone. So thanks for joining us today. We're really happy that you were all able to come to our rescheduled Science Policy 101 webinar. So thanks for joining us today. I'm going to quickly go over a few things to start off with. I'll do some introductions and let you know how you can use Fuse to participate. So today, I will be moderating. My name is Kathleen, and I'm serving as Interim Executive Director of Evidence for Democracy. Most of you will be familiar with our work, but for those who aren't, we are a fact-driven, non-partisan, not-for-profit, and we promote the transparent use of evidence in government decision-making in Canada. So science policy is very much in our wheelhouse. And I'm joined today with Dr. Jeffrey Kinder. Jeff has over 25 years of experience in science policy in the US and Canada, and he currently directs the Federal Science and Technology Secretariat that supports the Minister of Science and the Deputy Minister Champion for Federal Science. So I wanted to give you a little bit more info about E4D and how we approach evidence in government decision making. So we take a three-pronged approach. We educate citizens about science, the importance of evidence, and we also educate science and experts with workshops like this. We also have an independent and unique research program, okay, it would seem that some people can't hear us. If you can hear me, can you type in the chat? Let me know. Okay, Hillary has audio, so some people do. Okay, so I'm sorry for those who are having some issues. You should be able to pick up shortly. So I'm going to carry on, and if there are any issues, you can always come back to the recording. So coming back to E4D's approach, we do have an independent, unique research program which evaluates government policy, and we lead some issue-based campaigns. So using the chat function in Fuse, which it seems many of you have figured out here, that's great. If you haven't already, you can see a small chat bubble in the bottom right of your screen if you're using Fuse online. And you can type to the group chat. Everyone will be able to see it, as you can tell. So why don't we give a little test? If you haven't chimed in already, why don't you tell us your name in the group chat and where you are tuning in from? Okay, John in Vancouver, we've got Ottawa, Sven from Germany, Halifax, Montreal, Toronto, Kamloops, Winnipeg, Victoria, Montreal. This is great. So we have a lot of folks present from, it looks like, across the world. So this is really great. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. To hand things over to Jeff, who will get started with the Science Policy 101, and I will let him take over. Thanks, Jeff.
Great. Thank you. Well, so before we get into the presentation, a few things I want to start off with. So first of all, my thanks to Kat and Evidence for Democracy for inviting me to do this. I love talking about science policy, but I have no capacity to set up something as complicated as a webinar, so I'm very appreciative that, that she was able to set this up. I also need to say that I am a federal public servant, and so the usual disclaimer applies that anything I say today are my own opinions and not necessarily those of the government. And the third point I want to make is that, you know, we've got a little less than an hour here, but, you know, science policy is a very rich topic, and I think, you know, all we can hope for today is to sort of scratch the surface and hopefully whet your appetite to learn more about science policy. But I am going to be sort of operating from the assumption that we're starting from scratch and assume sort of no prior knowledge about science policy. So it'll be very much an intro Science Policy 101 type of presentation. Okay, and I've titled this Amplifying Collective Intelligence in a Post-Truth Era. It's already becoming a bit cliche to talk about the post-truth era, but I do think as we go forward and thinking about how we better integrate science and policy, we need to really grapple with the challenges that we're seeing around the world, obviously in the U.S., but also in Britain and elsewhere, in terms of the whole questioning of the role of evidence and the role of truth in policy decision making. So I think our context for science policy is changing, and at the same time, I think it's a very interesting time to be involved in science policy. We've got obviously here in Ottawa a government that's taking it very seriously, and so it's very much an exciting time. I would also add that in my many years of doing this, I've never seen the level of interest that we have at this point, particularly among young people who may be majoring in science and who are increasingly asking questions about what is the science policy and how can I get involved in that. So it's a very exciting time. So without further ado, let me jump in, and I'm learning the technology. There we go. So I think before we get into sort of what is science policy, I think it's helpful to just kind of start with the premise of, well, why should we even care? Why do governments care about science policy? Why do states or countries develop science and technology strategies or science policies? And there are many reasons, of course. The one I think we probably hear the most in terms of the political rhetoric from our most senior decision makers is the economic rationale, and that can be captured with this idea that science and technology form sort of the foundational steps towards innovation and on up the stairway to heaven here to increase productivity, competitiveness, and ultimately improve standard of living and quality of life. Now, for those who have actually studied the processes of science and innovation, it's a much more complicated process. And in fact, the idea that innovation flows sort of naturally from science and technology has been largely debunked. But I still think, in terms of the overall context for why governments say that they're supporting science, the economic rationale is perhaps the most important one. But of course, there are other rationales that are equally compelling. In particular, in the case of public policies, we even beyond the economic reasons, there's a whole wide range of policy areas that are impacted by science and technology, whether it's the development of new medicines or new energy technologies, and all of these things require a strong policy for both supporting science and technology, but also dealing with their consequences. And on this slide, we can see a whole range of these sort of exotic emerging technologies, whether it be artificial intelligence or robotics. And in the genomic space, there's a lot of interesting things happening with CRISPR and other technologies. So there's an important role for government to think through science and technology policy, because they need to both encourage some of these technologies, but also be prepared to regulate them in the public interest. There's also, frankly, a fiscal rationale. We spend a lot of money on science and technology activities. So in Canada, and the numbers may be a little off, but they should be in the right order of magnitude. So in Canada, we spend about over 30 billion a year on research and development. Now that's across all sectors, so private sector, universities, governments. We seem to be having a lot of fire sirens here in Ottawa, so give me a second. Hopefully Parliament's not burning down. So anyway, so we've got a lot of money invested in R&D. The government of Canada at the federal level spends about 10 billion a year on science and technology, and that represents about 4% of the overall budget. So it's not an insignificant investment, and so for those reasons as well, it makes sense that that a government would want to have a science policy. And then last but not least, of course, is the reason perhaps that most scientists are interested in science policy, and that is to obviously advance science, advance knowledge, advance our understanding of our place in the universe. There's also, related sort of cultural reasons that science can help combat irrationality and superstition and prejudice. And there's also even an aesthetic rationale because science does contribute to our culture and through art and other things. Now, you know, we would never expect to actually hear um, our senior decision makers sort of justifying the $10 billion investment in science and technology on these rationales alone, but they are part of the reasons why a society chooses to invest in science. And so for all of these reasons and others, it makes sense to understand science policy. So as we go forward, then we need to basically understand what these terms are, both science and policy. And so, like any good professor, we start with their definitions. And so, in terms of science, I'm taking a very broad view of what's included. And if we go back to the original Latin word, it simply meant knowledge. And of course, over time, we've defined it as knowledge that's generated through a very systematic approach, a systematic inquiry into to nature and phenomena. And over time, we've also tended to categorize the knowledge that results from science into these various buckets or disciplines. And so on the right of this slide, you can see those sciences or disciplines that are associated with the natural sciences, the life and physical sciences. Engineering is also part of how I'm defining science and technology. Sometimes the engineers take issue with being grouped in with science, but for the purposes of this discussion, we're including engineering. Of course, the health sciences there in the middle in the purple box. And then as you go further to the left of the slide, um, in some camps, it becomes a bit more controversial as to whether or not these are included in science, but the social sciences and humanities are also included in the way I'm defining science. And just a final point on this slide, not only have we grouped the disciplines into these buckets, but our funding granting councils are also organized around these. So the three red boxes on the right are supported by NSERC, the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council, the Health Sciences by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, and the Social Sciences and Humanities by SSHRC, the Research Council devoted to those disciplines. So that's a quick overview of science. And then what is policy? So there are probably 1,000 definitions of policy. I found this one several years ago, and I like it because it captures a lot of important aspects of what is policy. Now, first of all, of course, we're talking about public policy in this context. There are other forms of policy, like if you have a car, you may have an insurance policy. But here, of course, we're talking about public policy writ large. And I like this definition because it talks about it as an articulation of government priority, strategy, or objective, but also embraces the notion that policy bundles in the beliefs, principles, values, and actions of a government. We can think of policy as a roadmap or a set of directions to guide government's actions across a wide range of activities. So if that's what science is and what policy is in 30 seconds or less, it's important then to understand something that's perhaps unique about science policy, and that is that it has sort of two sides to the coin. So on the one side, we have what's called policy for science, and by that we mean basically that science policy is concerned about policies and government actions and strategies that support the scientific enterprise, including, as we say here, including STEM education and training, so education and training in the science, technology, engineering, and math disciplines. And in this way, it's not unlike other areas of policy where, whether it be health policy, foreign policy, or defense policy, where the government has a policy towards that endeavor or that activity or that community within the society. What's perhaps a bit different about science policy is that the other side of the coin is that there's science for policy, and this is the notion that um, science has the capability to provide evidence, to provide insights, ideas, results, but also methods that can help inform other areas of public policy. And so obviously evidence for democracy is very much about that side of the coin. And of course, as we'll see, and as we've seen over the last little while, this government is making a big push for a more evidence-based approach to decision making. And so, because of those emphases, I think we'll focus a little bit more today on science for policy. I'm happy to come back at some point if you want to talk more about policy for science, but I figured this audience in particular would be a bit perhaps more interested on the science for policy side. So just to give a couple more slides in terms of this distinction, and we don't want to make too much of the distinction because, in fact, ideally, the policy for science and science for policy are mutually supporting each other. But just to help clarify the distinction a little bit further, if you're a policy analyst for example, in say a government department such as Industry Canada, for example, in the federal government, who has the responsibility for science policy in the federal government. Some of the questions you might be dealing with are, trying to understand what needs society has for S&T, how those needs or how that S&T should be resourced, whether through a research tax credit to the private sector, through grants to university professors to do research, etc. I mean, there are many, many ways of resourcing it. You might think about sort of what are the needs in terms of personnel. Do we have the right balance between PhD scientists, technicians, and others? What institutional arrangements are most conducive to advancing S&T? And also what values should guide the profession? So these are some of the questions that you might grapple with if you're dealing with policy for science. On the flip side, if you're looking more at the science for policy types of questions, you might be grappling with issues of, so how can we ensure that results that are emerging from science can best inform policy decision making? What should count as evidence? A very important question. How can the methods, so it's not just the data and the results and insights, but are there methods that emerge from science and technology that can be brought into decision processes? An example here would be the whole area of risk analysis that came out of the S&T field and is now very much embedded in how the federal government approaches decision making. What's the appropriate relationship between science advisors and decision makers? And this is something we're obviously grappling with right now as the government looks to create a chief science advisor position and works through questions around who will that person report to, how open will that advice be versus a more confidential approach. So those are the types of questions that we're dealing with. As well as what other types of mechanisms are effective. So in Canada, we've experimented with many different types of arrangements. We're experimenting with a chief science advisor. We've had science advisory boards or advisory councils and many other mechanisms. And so again, these are some of the types of questions that you deal with when you're working more on the science for policy side. So like I said, I think we'll focus a little bit more for the rest of the slides on science for policy, and then obviously if folks have questions on either side, we can take those up at the end. I'll just pause. We're doing okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
You're doing well.
Excellent. Yeah. So let's keep going. I'll just plow through the rest of this, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So in terms of science for policy, another term that's often used or phrase that's often used is science and policy integration. And I think, we're getting very high level and clear signals from our senior decision makers that this is an area of importance. So for example, we can look at a couple quotes, one from our Governor General around the need to always look to the evidence, particularly scientific evidence, to help navigate change. Our Prime Minister recently said that scientific knowledge should inform decision making. So again, we're getting high-level signals that that science and evidence are important to our decision makers, and so that leads us to the question: well, what do they really want? Because sometimes we have to analyze what they think they want and what they say they want and what they really want. And so it's not just insights from science, but it's also assistance in framing a policy problem, providing context. Sometimes it's to support a position that they've already decided on, and we have to be aware that that happens. And the flip side of that, obviously, would be to provide ammunition to oppose a position that they want to be rejected. Or they may be looking for best practices from elsewhere, or perhaps more simply just proof of what works or doesn't. So there's many reasons why our senior decision makers might espouse an interest in evidence and informing science through evidence, and we need to understand what exactly is the rationale or the motive there. Because it's also helpful to remember what Keynes said, that there's nothing a government hates more than to be well informed, because it makes the process of arriving at decisions much more complicated and difficult. So a little dose of humility there to realize that science and policy integration is often espoused, but it's not necessarily appreciated. So this is a joke I like to use. You may have seen it in various forms, but I think it helps us understand the cultural divide between science and policy, and the need to bridge that divide. So a guy in a hot air balloon gets lost, descends to ask for directions. A woman on the ground shouts up precise latitude and longitude information and altitude information. The man in the balloon says, well, you must be a scientist. I ask you a simple question, you provide me too much information, and I'm still lost. To which the woman responds, well, you must be a policy analyst. You came out of nowhere with your questions. I give you the most accurate and precise answer I can. You're still lost, and yet you blame me. So I think it speaks to some of the barriers that we need to overcome. So let's explore that a little bit. So first of all, I think it's very important that we take home the message that the responsibility for integrating science and policy lies on both sides. I think too often I hear, the policy side will say, this whole problem could be solved if those scientists could just learn how to speak in plain language, or, could just work on the policy priorities of the day. And on the other side, scientists will often say, well, we'd be happy to if only the policy side could tell us exactly what those priorities are, or if they could, just increase their science literacy a little bit to help understand what we're working on. So I think we'll never resolve this problem of integration, which is challenging, if we just blame the other side. I think both sides need to realize that we need to work together to bridge the divide. And to do that, I think we can't wait until a decision is required to try to foster that integration. I think it requires early and ongoing interactions, and relationships are key to that. So let's look a little bit at the two cultures. Of course, the two cultures refers back to a famous lecture by C.P. Snow in 1960. He delivered at Harvard. He was talking more in terms of science as one culture, and more the literary and artistic culture as the other side of the coin. But I think it works just as well to look at science and policy as two cultures, and often two solitudes that need to be brought together. But there are some obvious barriers to that. So, and this slide gets at just some of those. But I think one of the big ones is time horizon. So, in science, we're often working for quite a long time. In a particular area, it can take weeks, months, years, even to achieve results. Policy it tends to be on a much quicker time horizon, and needs input often very quickly. The language we speak is often quite different. Scientists do tend to seek precision in their language, and on the other side, policy prefers a bit more flexibility and prefers to have a bit of wiggle room, if you will, in the language that they're using. Uncertainty is another area where we have differences, because the scientists and the science world is very familiar with uncertainty, is tolerant of it. We speak in terms of confidence intervals, and we understand degrees of freedom and standard deviations. But on the policy side, there's often less comfort with uncertainty. Sometimes a minister will just say, "Give me the answer," and not have a lot of patience for a lot of caveats around the certainty. On the other hand, I've also seen this play out the other way, where The policy side, sometimes is quite savvy and realizes that the knowledge is only as good as it is at that time. And the scientists are sometimes sort of slow or hesitant to give up the data for the policymaker because of concerns about it being misused or it not being as robust as they would have liked. So that uncertainty one can actually play both ways, but it is a barrier. I think there's also just frankly a different audience, particularly. So this is particularly true of integrating science and policy within government. The science that we do in government even is still tending to look to the broader scientific community as its audience, and using scientific peers to review their work. And so their accountability is therefore more horizontal to the community writ large. Whereas in policy, because of the Westminster system, we're still very much geared towards accountability up the vertical chain of command within departments, up to the minister, and then ultimately to the public. And so, because of these different audiences and accountabilities, there can be some tension sometimes in science and government and science and policy integration. Transparency is another one. Obviously, at least in the academic setting, science is usually positioned as a very open process. We publish our results in the open academic literature. On the policy side, it can sometimes be a bit more closed, particularly at the level of cabinet decision making. That's usually a much more closed process. Tenure is another potential difference, whereas scientists tend to work within their fields for most of their careers, and often, like in government, they'll stay within a department for most of their careers. The policy world tends to rotate around much more frequently, and that can make creating those relationships trickier because there is so much more turnover on the policy side. And frankly, in terms of where government science is located, at least, it tends to be out in the regions, whereas policy is almost exclusively a headquarters kind of function, and so is typically located in Ottawa. And so, obviously, with web tools and video conferencing, we can overcome some of those physical barriers, but there is a bit of a geographical divide as well as a cultural divide. So, for all of those reasons, there are barriers to integrating science and policy, but I don't think any of them are so difficult to overcome if there's not if there's the will to overcome them. I think we can. So, one way to start that process is to think about how science and policy relate, and we start with a very simplistic view of the world from sort of a science-centric perspective, which is to say that sometimes science sees itself as being this sort of beacon of truth that puts all of its knowledge out into the open academic literature. And so, from this kind of very simplistic perspective, there is no real problem with integration because the policy world is free to look at that science just as free as anyone else. But of course, we can appreciate that the policymakers don't have the time to read journal articles, and even if they did, they probably wouldn't understand most of it. So this very sort of simplistic model of just put the science out there and allow it to be taken up and integrated into policy is perhaps overly simplistic. A bit more nuanced approach is to take more of a decision maker perspective, and this you see a lot in the literature on science policy. And this is the notion that science can feed into the decision maker and ultimately impact the outcome or the policy. And this, of course, is also very simplistic, but it does start to resonate a bit more with some of the language we often use, and particularly when we talk in terms of evidence-based decision making. There is sometimes a sense that if we can just get the evidence in front of the decision maker, then our job is done, and that results in evidence-based policy. And I think that's a bit overly simplistic, and I'll explain that. If for no other reason, science doesn't speak with one voice, and particularly when we're dealing with public policy issues that are very multidimensional and multidisciplinary, We need inputs from multiple science voices, and so the decision maker needs to grapple with that. But more importantly, of course, science is rarely, I would say probably never, the only consideration that a decision maker has. And so obviously there are political or economic, perhaps legal considerations. If it's an international issue, it may have diplomatic implications. So there's a whole list of other considerations that the decision maker has to take into account, science being only one of them. And this is where most of the literature tends to stop, basically saying, this is the model for how science inputs into policy. It has to compete with all these other considerations. But even this is overly simplistic, because particularly nowadays, it's rare that you have a single decision maker. And in this government, they've made very clear that they are taking a more cabinet approach to governance, which means multiple decision makers at the table. And I would also argue that it's rare that a decision maker would sort of approach a problem with this sort of laundry list of considerations, and they kind of tick down through each one of them to make sure that they've thought through each of these implications. But rather, what will often happen is, different decision makers will come to the table with different lenses. That is the way they think about these issues. And so we've gone from a very sort of neat and tidy linear approach where science is inputting into decision making to a very messy one where we hope that there is a decision maker at the table that is bringing the scientific perspective. So perhaps a bit a better way of thinking about how science and policy interact, or at least how the policy making process works, and then how science has to deal with that, is taking more of an issue-centric perspective. And based on many interventions with or interactions with policy people over the years, this model does seem to resonate. That this is kind of how things often work in government, and that is that it's issue based, and so an issue comes into the or an issue emerges and enters into some sort of decision making system or prism, if you will, and depending then on the characteristics of that prism, you get different outcomes on the other side. So my background in physics is evident here, and you can think of it as an optics problem where light is coming into a prism, and depending on the characteristics of the prism, you get different bending of the light coming out the other side. So in our case, however, the three-sided prism is actually perhaps five-sided, and these are some of the variables then that will influence the decision-making process. And ideas and information are obviously a big part of it, but also interests, individuals, institutions, and instruments. Now, I won't dwell on this in detail, but obviously there are all of these variables and others that go into decision making. And so what we have then is an issue coming into this framework. We still have the multiple decision makers in there as well, and those are sort of bubbles in the prism. And again, I think most of the policy people will say, yeah, that kind of resonates with how we see our job of developing policy. The problem with this from the scientific point of view is, so nowhere is there an explicit input from science. And I think that's the reality, is that science does not have necessarily a privileged input into policymaking, but it has to, just as any other area, compete with other inputs by providing either better ideas, better information, but also interests, dealing with interests, individuals, institutions, and instruments, perhaps providing new technological solutions or providing new methods. And so we've gone from a world where science has a very direct and obvious impact on policy to one that's a bit more complicated for science to navigate. Now, again, if the onus is on both sides, then the policy world also needs to better understand the scientific world. And so, again, we'll start with a very simplistic approach, and that's the basic, scientific method that we all learned in probably 7th grade or something. which starts with a question and a hypothesis that leads to an experiment and analyzing data, and then finally some results and conclusions. Now, again, if any of you, and I'm sure many of you have been involved in doing scientific research, you know that this is a very simplistic approach. Although it does sort of ring true at a very high level. Um, the process of science and research is obviously much more complicated. There's a lot of feedback loops. It doesn't proceed in this kind of neat and tidy linear fashion. But again, if we were to think in terms of senior policymakers, recognizing that many of them do not come from the sciences, that class in high school may have been their last exposure to science, and so this may be in the back of their mind how science really works, and so that can lead to a very simplistic relationship where they, for example, a minister may ask the scientists in their department a question and expect a fairly simple and straightforward process to lead to an answer. But of course, those who have ever engaged in science know that it is also a much more messy and complex process. This is a diagram from a website that's listed there at the bottom of the slide. I encourage you to go to that website because it's a dynamic website that when you sort of scroll over each of these bubbles, it expands and shows even more characteristics. But I think the key point here is that there are lots of feedback loops. It's a lot messier. But also the purple bubble on the right shows that it's a community activity. And I think that's where the policy side can really benefit by tapping into the science world, because it is so much of a community-based activity and network-based. It's easy for policy then to tap into a very broad network through the science world. And then another area where science can help the policy side is this understanding of there are different ways of using evidence and abusing evidence, and not necessarily for nefarious reasons. I mean, sometimes, um, for example, under mishandling the evidence, decision makers basically take a piece of science advice and use it beyond the scope that it was intended for. So nothing nefarious there, but again, with a closer integration of science and policy, we can avoid some of these abuses. Others obviously are more difficult to deal with, where, for example, the policy side may be looking for evidence that supports a decision they've already made. They may manipulate advisory committees to sort of stack them with people that they think will give them the advice they want. But if we have a more robust relationship, then we can expose some of that and explore how to improve that situation. It's also important to remember the is-ought fallacy that was explored by a famous philosopher, David Hume. And this is the idea that sometimes it's easy, even for scientists, to slip from scientific statements of what is and very objective statements to what ought to be or what should be, which is obviously a normative statement. And so these are just a couple examples where let's take the second one, for example. So immunization prevents disease. That's a scientifically defensible position. But then to say that so therefore everyone should be immunized is a normative position. And of course, we see that playing out in the whole anti-vaxxer issue. So it's important to understand this distinction. And I'm not going to spend much time on this one, although I highly recommend Pilkey's book, The Honest Broker, where he goes into this whole idea of scientists need to better understand in what way they are approaching the policy world, whether they're seeking to be, in particular, an honest broker versus an issue advocate. And I highly recommend you read further on that. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to move through these fairly quickly. So I do want to hit on this notion of knowledge mobilization. So this has become a bit of a buzzword in recent years, and I think it's important because it definitely relates to the world of science and policy integration as well. One of the things that comes out of Pilkey's work and others is this notion of knowledge brokers. And traditionally, they've been seen as sort of intermediaries between the science world and the policy world. And so if we look at the Venn diagram on the left, we see that those two worlds of science and policy are not directly interacting, but that a knowledge broker can be a bit of a bridge and help transfer and mobilize knowledge across those two communities. My concern with that approach is that it basically lets science and policy sort of off the hook, in the sense that the integration of science and policy is not their job, but it's this other person's job, this knowledge broker's job. And so they can go on sort of isolated in their own little world of science or policy, and not worry as much about integration. So I actually prefer the idea, or the Venn diagram on the right, which sees a knowledge broker's role more as a facilitator of the environment in which science and policy are directly interacting, and the knowledge broker is there to help that process work better. And then the problem with the previous slide, of course, is that it still stays primarily focused on just science and policy. And to go back to the title and the whole era that we're in of post-truth, we need to grapple much more deliberately around how do we bring society into this conversation. And of course, the science policy interface is part of society, and so shouldn't. Sometimes you'll see society as a third circle or a third bubble. I prefer to see the science policy interface as being embedded within society. But then, how do we better open up that interface and that integration through things like open science, citizen science, foresight, science policy hackathons, etc. And I'd be happy to explore that further with you. A few more thoughts. So again, to come back to this notion that if we think of integration only as something that needs to happen when a decision is required, we'll never be successful. And we need to move from this kind of thinking to early and ongoing interactions between the two streams of policy and science. And ideally, we get to a point where they're not parallel streams, but more of a virtuous circle where policy for science is helping to identify what research would be helpful in a policy context. That helps drive the research agenda, but in turn, science then generates results that may inform the policy agenda. And again, ideally, that becomes a virtuous circle of policy for science, for policy for science, for policy for science. So last thought I want to leave you with, and I know that there have been other webinars around science communication, so I won't dwell on this, but I do think communication is a huge skill that needs to be practiced deliberately. It needs to be paid attention to. It's as it says here, it often means paying as much attention to your briefing as to your analysis. And the final thought here, of course, is that in the science world, we're very comfortable with journal articles, with formal assessments and expert panel reviews. They're very rigorous. The problem is there's a bit of an inverse relationship between rigor and what instruments are actually used in the policy world, which are briefing notes and verbal briefs. So we lose some of the rigor, but then those are the instruments that are actually used in policy. So again, we need to understand how we best communicate the science in a way that the policy world can take that up. And with that, I am going to stop and open it up for discussion.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jeff. That was really, really good, and definitely even changed some of my own thinking about the science policy interface. So thanks for sharing all your insights. So I'll just sort of, as that information settles in for everybody, I want you to, maybe think of some questions you have for Jeff, because we do have some time for Q&A. And in the meantime, if you aren't already a member of our network of experts, you can sign up on our website. So we provide webinar trainings like this and in-person training, as well as one-on-one opportunities for science communication and science policy training for our members. It's free to join, so please look into that if you're not already a member. Something certainly to consider. And also our next webinar in the Science Policy series will be from Susanna Fuller, and that will be Science Policy 102. She'll be sharing some of her experience of getting her science into policy and what that was like. So a bit more sort of a concrete example or case study that you could look at. So that will be coming in May. So stay tuned and make sure to register for that one. That being said, for Q&A, if you have questions, I would invite you to type them in the group chat, and I will help filter them for Jeff. But I know that some people did submit some questions ahead of time, and so I will kick off with one of those. It was asked, given the situation for science in the United States, what happens to Canadian science policy when American research funding taps are turned off?
Wow, so that's a good question, and I would say obviously the situation currently in the U.S. is very worrisome with respect to science funding and science support. Um, and obviously our science systems are very, very interlinked and integrated, so it's a concern to Canada as well. I think there is a possibility to see it as a bit of an opportunity. I think there may be some in the States who would welcome the opportunity to come to Canada and do research here. So that's something that we could potentially pursue. Um, I think obviously the granting councils provide funding to the academic research, and the ability to do collaborations internationally is very important. We can help attract or at least integrate and collaborate with scientists in the U.S. Um, but it's a concern, absolutely. I don't have any silver bullet solution.
Yeah, certainly, and it's something that E4D is thinking about a lot. I think all of the entire science community is thinking through these issues. So Logan has a question. So in your experience, are scientists most effective at getting research into policy by acting on their own with other scientists or with broader groups, for example, citizen or issue-specific groups, or is the solo route better?
So that's an excellent question. Actually, one I haven't really thought a lot about, but I would say both ways can work. I wouldn't say that one is definitely superior over the other, but to some extent it goes back to Pilkey's work on honest brokers versus issue advocates. There is the risk potentially that if you're aligning with an advocacy group, that you would lose the ability to provide um, credible and independent advice as an individual. Um, I'm not saying that's definitely the case. I'm just saying it's something to think through as a scientist, whether you're okay with being in that issue advocate role versus an honest broker role. But I think both avenues can work. In terms of, I mean, my own preference is for more collaborative approaches. So I would see benefit in trying to, uh, you know, find other like-minded scientists who you can collaborate with to help present the evidence. But I think either can work.
We see lots of examples of both.
Absolutely.
So we have a question from Kathleen, not me, the other Kathleen. She's wondering, how do you go about improving your policy knowledge if you potentially as a scientist want to go that route for a career? Where do you start?
Well, so that's an excellent question. There are many and a growing number of opportunities to do that. So let me just highlight some of those. Obviously, evidence for democracy and getting involved here. And I'm
Thank
not
you.
the shameless plug, I guess, but that's an obvious route. There's something called the Canadian Science Policy Conference that has now operated for about 9 years, and it will be holding its conference this year again in Ottawa in November. It's almost entirely volunteer driven, and so I highly encourage you to not only come to the conference, but look to get involved as a volunteer. Just recently, the MyTax organization created a fellowships program that brings in postdocs and faculty members into government departments for a one-year fellowship that exposes them obviously to the policy world. But also, I mean, those are some of the formal mechanisms. I think, informally, just recognizing that you have an interest in science policy or in policy, read the budget, read the speech from the throne, learn what the government's doing in the policy and in the science policy spheres. Um, There are also workshops. In fact, I'm involved in offering science policy workshops through the CSPC. So I think there are a lot and a growing number of opportunities to do that. In fact, as I said at the beginning, I'm really struck by I've never seen so much interest and demand for this kind of science policy 101 opportunity. So um, yeah, I think if you seek it out, you'll find opportunities.
Okay, so we've got another question from Anastasia, who was wondering if there's many career paths at intersections of science and policy and law. Is that something you see often? And if so, what does that look like?
Wow, so that's interesting. So I actually don't have a good answer for that one. Obviously, policy and law are closely related, and so
Yeah.
um, I mean, you could pursue it through policy programs, through law programs. Um, they're also obviously understanding legislation and getting involved in helping shape and influence legislation would be another way to bring those three together. Um, it's a good question. I'll think more about it.
Yeah. So we have a question that's been seconded. So Sean was asking, if we're basing sort of science advice and evidence and policy on the assumption that the government's interested in making sort of the best policy for its citizens, is this when it's not the case, when there's sort of special interests that are at play, where alternative facts come in, how do we deal with that?
Yeah, well, that's a good
I
question.
think we're all thinking
I think
about
we're
that
all
one
trying to
now.
figure
Yeah.
that one out. Yeah, absolutely. And again, I don't have the silver bullet solution, but we definitely need to grapple with this because in this world of fake news and alternative facts and celebrity views on vaccinations and other things, we need to grapple with it. So I think there's opportunities to have these conversations. I tend to go to we need a more open approach to science and to science advice to bring society into those conversations. Historically, traditionally, the science advice processes have been quite closed. And I think part of the answer is to open those up and figure out how we bring in voices that haven't been part of that process in the past.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. So we've got a question from Vanessa here about science communication. So is the onus just on scientists to do science communication more effectively? Either I think to decision makers. I'm going to broaden your question, Vanessa. Is this to decision makers and to the public? Or is it more of a broader effort to empower the lay community? I'm going to include decision makers in that to be more discerning consumers of science information.
Yeah. So, I mean, most of the focus obviously today is science and policy, but I would say science and public as well is important. So, the communications I think needs to be multidimensional or multidirectional, I should say, um, and bring the public into your labs, bring um, the media in, and have interviews with the media. As part of the granting council's applications now, you need to include a knowledge mobilization plan. But I'm often struck by how narrow those are usually construed to be. We're going to do a presentation at our disciplinary conference every year, and we're going to publish in academic journals. Well, yes, that is a form of mobilizing knowledge, but there are many other creative ways that we can engage more directly with the public. Consider writing a 4-page policy brief in plain language about what you're doing. Um, it's a simple thing, but you'd be amazed at how far that can go. So
Yeah. So we have a question from Abby, and I think this is probably the last one, and it's actually quite timely for E for D. But Abby asks, are provincial policies directed, in quotes, by federal policies on any topic? Because the decision makers aren't always in Ottawa. And so E4D is actually taking on science integrity issues at the provincial level now, starting with BC. So we'll be releasing a report next week. But would love your take on it, Jeff.
Well, so I think we're seeing a real interest at the provincial level. Obviously, in Quebec, there has been for quite some time a chief science advisor, so it's sort of science policy and science advisory ecosystem is fairly well developed. We're now seeing the Ontario government is in the process of creating a chief science advisor. I know the Alberta government is grappling with its science policy strategy. So I think there's increasing interest at the provincial level, and perhaps an increasing appetite for federal provincial discussions around this. Yeah. So we'll see.
Time will tell. Hopefully, I think it's something we're really looking forward to, seeing how the provincial chief scientists interact with the new CSA right. and all of this when some things get moving. So it's exciting times. So I think we'll end on that note. I wanted to let everyone know that we will email you a short questionnaire for some feedback that will help us improve webinars, give you a chance to let us know what worked and what didn't. And we'll provide you with some resources after some of the things that Jeff mentioned. If you were furiously taking notes and didn't quite get down a book title or something like that, we will send you an email with some resources as well. And if you have any follow-up questions or issues, you can send me an email at Kathleen@evidencefordemocracy.ca. So thanks so much for attending, everyone. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join us and to learn with us. And we look forward to the next one. Thanks to Jeff as well, and we'll talk soon.